Hours before the funeral of Iran's own supreme leader, one of the country's most senior military commanders stood in front of cameras delivering a fiery, defiant address to foreign proxy media, projecting exactly the kind of unshaken confidence Tehran wanted the world to see. Then the funeral procession began. State broadcasts rolled, photographers captured every senior official filing into the Tehran Musalla to pay their respects. And he simply wasn't there. Not in the official photographs, not in the live broadcast. Not anywhere in the carefully choreographed display of unity, Iran's government spent days preparing for the entire world to watch. The commander of Iran's navy had, without explanation, vanished from public view. And in a regime that has spent the last 100 days watching its senior military leadership get systematically eliminated one funeral at a time, that kind of silence is never just a scheduling conflict. To understand why this single absence has intelligence analysts and Iran watchers across the region paying such close attention, you need to understand exactly what this war has already done to Iran's command structure. Because this is not the first time a senior commander has disappeared, and every previous disappearance in this conflict has ended the same devastating way. When this war opened, in a single wave of coordinated strikes, the United States and Israel didn't just target missile sites and nuclear facilities. They specifically targeted the men running Iran's military, and the results were staggering. The commander of the IRGC was killed within the opening hours of fighting. His successor lasted barely 8 months before he too was killed in a later wave of strikes. The chief of the general staff of Iran's entire armed forces was killed in that same initial assault, his position left vacant ever since, an empty chair at the top of Iran's military hierarchy that nobody has been willing or able to fill. This is a war that opened by systematically decapitating an entire tier of senior leadership, and it has kept doing so in wave after wave ever since. Now I need you to sit with what it means that this specific commander vanished at this specific moment, because timing in a war like this one is never accidental. This absence happened during Iran's own supreme leader's funeral, an event so significant that the government closed the entire airspace over Tehran for the procession, an event every surviving senior official in the regime had every possible incentive to attend, if only to be photographed standing firmly behind the new leadership during the most fragile moment of political transition Iran has faced in decades. Brigadier General Ahmad Vahidi, who now commands the IRGC after his own predecessor was killed on the war's opening day, made what state media described as a rare public appearance specifically for this funeral, sitting visibly beside the late Supreme Leader's casket for the cameras. If the head of the Revolutionary Guard himself understood that this funeral required a visible, photographed appearance to project stability, the absence of the Navy's own commander from that same carefully staged display becomes almost impossible to explain as simple bad timing. And this is where the story widens into something far more unsettling than one missing admiral, because Iran's own leadership transition has been shrouded in exactly this kind of uncertainty from the very top down. Reports out of the region have raised serious, pointed questions about the whereabouts of Mojtaba Khamenei himself, the man who has assumed the role of supreme leader following his father's death. According to intelligence assessments circulating through regional media, Khamenei is reportedly not even inside the country, with senior Revolutionary Guard officials allegedly working to obscure his absence both from the Iranian public and from the outside world, drafting statements attributed to him while he himself has never once been seen in public, not even at his own father's funeral. Read that again. The son who inherited control of the Islamic Republic during the middle of an active war against two of the most capable militaries on earth has, according to these reports, never actually appeared in public since taking the position. If that account holds up, an entire government is currently being run through statements attributed to a man nobody can confirm is even present in the country he supposedly leads. This is the exact environment inside which the Navy commander's disappearance needs to be understood, because a leadership vacuum at the very top creates ripple effects all the way down the chain of command. When intelligence analysts and Iran watchers scan a funeral broadcast counting exactly which senior officials appeared and which ones didn't, they are not engaging in idle speculation. They are doing something militaries and intelligence services have done for decades during moments of political uncertainty in closed authoritarian systems, reading the visible gaps in a regime's own choreographed display of strength as a map of who is actually still alive, still in command, still trusted enough by whoever currently holds power to be allowed anywhere near a camera. Every commander who appears at a funeral like this one is making a public statement of loyalty and survival. Every commander who doesn't appear is leaving a blank space that everyone watching is left to fill in themselves. So what actually explains an absence like this? Let's walk through the realistic possibilities, because each one carries dramatically different implications for how this war unfolds from here. The first possibility is the simplest, and the one Iranian officials would obviously prefer the world believe. A scheduling conflict, an operational deployment somewhere that genuinely couldn't be interrupted even for a funeral of this magnitude, or a security decision made specifically to keep a senior naval commander away from a single, heavily concentrated target, where an entire tier of surviving leadership would be gathered in one place at one time. This war has already shown that mass gatherings of senior Iranian officials have proven catastrophically dangerous before. It would not be irrational for Iran's own security apparatus to have deliberately kept certain commanders away from the funeral, specifically to avoid repeating that mistake, spreading out the risk rather than concentrating Iran's remaining military leadership inside a single vulnerable location. The second possibility is considerably darker, and it's the one that history inside this exact conflict makes impossible to dismiss. This war has already killed an extraordinary number of Iran's most senior military figures in strikes specifically targeting leadership rather than equipment or infrastructure. Given that established pattern, the straightforward, brutal possibility has to sit on the table that this commander is no longer alive, killed in an operation that Tehran has not yet publicly acknowledged. Exactly the same silence that followed several previous leadership deaths in this war, before state media eventually confirmed what had already happened days or weeks earlier. The third possibility is the one that speaks to something happening entirely inside Iran's own government, separate from anything Washington or Israel has done. A commander who vanishes not because of an external strike, but because of an internal political reckoning, detained, sidelined, or removed by Iran's own counterintelligence apparatus amid suspicion of disloyalty, foreign contact, or involvement in the string of security failures that have plagued this war from its opening hours. This is not a hypothetical scenario invented for dramatic effect. Iran's own Quds Force commander disappeared from public view for an extended period earlier in this broader conflict under almost identical circumstances, with speculation swirling for weeks over whether he had been killed in a strike, detained by his own government's security services over suspected collusion, or had simply gone into hiding to avoid becoming the next target. That precedent alone tells you this is a genuinely live possibility, not a far-fetched conspiracy theory. Widen the lens further, and you start to see why this single absence matters so much more than the fate of one individual commander. Because Iran's navy occupies a uniquely important position in exactly the part of this war generating the most global attention right now. This is the branch of Iran's military most directly responsible for operations inside the Strait of Hormuz, the exact waterway where tanker attacks, naval mines, and fast boat harassment campaigns have driven oil prices higher and triggered a genuine global energy crisis over the past several months. A leadership gap at the top of the force running that campaign, whether from death, detention, or simple sidelining, raises an uncomfortable operational question that regional military analysts are only beginning to ask openly. Who is actually making the day-to-day decisions about naval operations in the Strait right now? Is command flowing smoothly to a deputy with clear authority? Or is Iran's most economically consequential military campaign currently being run through exactly the kind of command confusion that tends to produce the sort of unpredictable, uncoordinated incidents, like the tanker attacks that collapsed the last ceasefire, that a functioning chain of command would normally have prevented? To understand exactly why this specific kind of disappearance carries so much weight inside Iran's own command culture, it helps to look at the precedent this exact position has already lived through once before. Qasem Soleimani, the legendary commander of the Quds Force who spent decades building and coordinating Iran's entire regional proxy network, was assassinated by the United States in a targeted strike in Baghdad back in 2020, a single surgical operation that eliminated arguably the most influential military strategist Iran had produced in a generation. His successor, Esmail Qaani, inherited a role that immediately made him one of the most closely watched men in the entire region, precisely because everyone understood how catastrophic it would be for Iran's proxy coordination if the same fate befell him. And in an earlier chapter of this broader conflict, it did appear to happen, or at least appeared close enough to happening that the uncertainty itself became a story. Qaani vanished from public view for an extended stretch following a strike that killed a senior Hezbollah official who had been considered a successor to the group's own slain leader. Qaani was absent from Friday prayers he would normally have attended alongside Iran's supreme leader. He was absent from Revolutionary Guard ceremonies, where his presence would ordinarily have been expected. Iranian officials insisted he was alive. Regional intelligence services spent weeks debating three identical possibilities to the ones we just walked through: killed in the strike itself, detained by Iran's own internal security services over suspicions of compromised communications, or simply gone to ground to avoid becoming the next target in a campaign that had already claimed his predecessor. That episode eventually resolved, but not before it demonstrated something crucial about how this exact kind of disappearance functions inside Iran's command structure. It doesn't just create uncertainty about one man, it creates a chilling effect across every other senior commander watching the same pattern play out, forcing hard, constant choices between public visibility, which projects strength and continuity, and operational secrecy, which offers survival at the direct cost of exactly the visible unity a wartime government most needs to project. That tension between the need to be seen and the need to stay hidden is precisely what makes senior military life inside Iran's current command structure so brutally difficult right now, and it has direct consequences for how effectively Iran's broader proxy network can actually be coordinated day to day. Iran's regional strategy has never depended on Tehran acting alone. It depends on a tightly coordinated web of allied forces, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Houthi forces in Yemen, allied militias across Iraq, all of them historically synchronized through exactly the kind of senior IRGC and Quds Force leadership, now suffering these repeated disappearances and losses. Every commander killed, detained, or forced into hiding is a broken link in a coordination chain that took decades to build. A missing naval commander affects operations in the Strait of Hormuz directly. A missing or uncertain Quds Force leadership affects the timing, targeting, and coherence of proxy attacks across an entire region simultaneously. This is why intelligence services don't just track individual disappearances in isolation. They track the cumulative pattern because the cumulative pattern is what actually determines whether Iran's regional strategy still functions as a coordinated whole or increasingly operates as a collection of separately improvising fronts, each one making its own decisions, without the centralized coordination that used to be one of Iran's genuine strategic advantages. Why does this keep happening to Iran specifically? And what does it say about the actual state of the regime after 100 days of war? A Gulf-based security analyst who has spent years studying Iran's military command structure offered this assessment in a private briefing, circulating among regional defense correspondents. What we're watching isn't a single missing commander, the analyst explained. It's the accumulated effect of a leadership decapitation campaign that has now run for months, layered on top of a supreme leadership transition that appears, by every available account, deeply unstable in its own right. Militaries function on clear chains of command and predictable succession. When you kill enough senior leaders in a short enough window and simultaneously leave the very top of the political and religious hierarchy shrouded in genuine uncertainty about who is actually in charge, you don't just lose individual officers. You start to lose the institutional muscle memory that keeps an entire military coordinated under pressure. That is precisely the kind of environment where a single missing admiral stops being a minor personnel mystery and starts looking like a symptom of something structurally much bigger. That is the real fear rippling through analysts watching this war right now, not this one commander. What his absence might reveal about everyone above him. Here's where the story pivots, though, because a decapitated leadership structure doesn't automatically mean a collapsing one, and Iran has already demonstrated, repeatedly throughout this war, an ability to keep fighting even after losing commander after commander in rapid succession. Every time this war has killed a senior IRGC or army official, a successor has been named, in some cases within days, and operations have continued, imperfectly, unevenly, but continued nonetheless. Ahmad Vahidi's appearance at the funeral, sitting visibly beside the late Supreme Leader's casket, was itself a deliberate signal that the chain of command, however battered, was still functioning well enough to produce a visible face of continuity when the moment demanded one. Authoritarian, revolutionary military structures like Iran's are often built with exactly this kind of redundancy in mind. Layers of ideologically loyal deputies ready to step into a role the moment a superior is killed, precisely because founders of these systems have always assumed that assassination and decapitation strikes were a realistic threat they needed to plan around from the very beginning. And there is a further layer of resilience worth acknowledging honestly. Iran's Revolutionary Guard has spent decades cultivating a command culture built around ideological loyalty to the institution itself, rather than loyalty to any single individual commander. A structure specifically designed to survive exactly the kind of leadership losses this war has inflicted. That doesn't mean the losses haven't mattered. Institutional memory, operational expertise, and battlefield judgment accumulated over decades of service are not easily replaced by a rapid promotion, no matter how ideologically committed the replacement is. But it does mean that betting on Iran's military simply falling apart because of one more missing commander has proven throughout this entire war to be a consistently losing bet. This is a system that has absorbed catastrophic leadership losses before and kept functioning, however diminished, however uneven, however dependent on a shrinking pool of experienced officers still willing and able to step forward. There is also a broader historical pattern worth remembering here, because authoritarian regimes under sustained external pressure have a long, well-documented history of deliberately obscuring the health, whereabouts, or survival of senior officials, precisely because uncertainty itself can function as a defensive tool. A regime that never confirms whether a commander is alive, detained, or simply relocated denies its adversaries the psychological victory of a confirmed kill, while simultaneously denying internal rivals a clear opportunity to consolidate power around a confirmed death or disappearance. This is not a uniquely Iranian tactic. Governments under this kind of pressure throughout modern history have used exactly this kind of strategic ambiguity, sometimes for months at a time, before the truth eventually surfaces, one way or another. That history should make everyone watching this specific disappearance resist the urge to draw a confident conclusion in either direction. The silence itself may be the entire point. Consider what this specific kind of uncertainty means for the people whose job it is to actually predict what happens next in the Strait of Hormuz. Because a missing naval commander doesn't just create a mystery for intelligence analysts to debate. It creates a genuine operational risk for every ship, every shipping company, and every energy trader whose decisions depend on some baseline assumption of predictability from Iran's naval forces. Throughout this war, the tanker attacks, the naval mine incidents, and the small boat harassment campaigns that have driven oil prices higher have all, in different ways, been attributed to decisions made somewhere inside Iran's naval and IRGC command structure. When that structure's own visible leadership goes dark at the exact moment a fragile ceasefire framework has already collapsed, the honest, uncomfortable question that regional risk analysts have to sit with is whether operational decisions in the Strait right now are flowing through a clear, accountable chain of command, or whether they are increasingly being made by mid-level commanders operating with less oversight than the outside world assumes. A chain of command with a confirmed, visible commander at the top is at least theoretically capable of being deterred, negotiated with, or held accountable through traditional diplomatic and military channels. A chain of command with an uncertain, possibly vacant top is far harder to predict, far harder to negotiate with, and, according to several of the risk assessments already circulating among shipping insurers, considerably more likely to produce exactly the kind of unauthorized or poorly coordinated incident that ends up triggering escalation nobody at the top actually intended. There's a deeper layer to this story that ties directly back to the uncertainty surrounding Mojtaba Khamenei himself. Because a missing naval commander inside a functioning, confident government would likely have been quickly and confidently explained, one way or another, within days. The fact that this absence has instead generated exactly the same kind of open speculation that has surrounded Iran's own supreme leader tells you something important about the state of the regime's internal communication and confidence right now. A government fully in control of its own narrative does not typically allow this many senior figures to disappear from public view without offering a clear, confident explanation for at least one of them. The fact that neither the Navy commander's absence nor the Supreme Leader's own whereabouts have been definitively clarified suggests an institution currently more focused on managing appearances than on actually explaining what has happened to its most senior people, a posture that itself signals internal uncertainty, regardless of what the underlying truth eventually turns out to be. When multiple senior figures across a government all go quiet at roughly the same time, without a unified, confident explanation for any of them, the simplest and most honest read is not that each disappearance is unrelated. It's that the machinery normally responsible for managing public confidence in Iran's leadership is currently under more strain than it has been at any point since this war began. This is precisely why regional governments watching this unfold are treating it as more than idle curiosity. Gulf states with direct economic exposure to the Strait of Hormuz have every incentive to understand exactly how stable or unstable the chain of command actually is on the other side of that waterway. Because their own tanker traffic, their own energy exports, and their own diplomatic engagement with Tehran all depend on having some reliable read of who is actually making decisions inside Iran's military right now. Diplomatic channels that would normally route through a known, established commander become far less reliable when that commander's own status is in question, forcing outside governments to either wait for clarity that may not come quickly, or attempt to open parallel channels with whichever deputy or successor appears to be functionally running operations in his place, an uncertain, improvised approach to diplomacy that increases the odds of miscommunication at exactly the moment this war can least afford another one. So where does that leave the actual question we opened with? What does it mean that Iran's top naval commander just vanished from public view? The honest answer is that nobody outside Iran's own innermost security circle knows for certain right now, and that uncertainty is precisely why this story matters as much as it does. What we do know with confidence is this: Iran enters the next phase of this war with a supreme leader transition, shrouded in genuine doubt about whether the man now nominally in charge has ever actually been seen by anyone outside a small inner circle. It enters this phase having already lost, through direct military action, the commander of its Revolutionary Guard, that commander's own successor and the chief of the general staff of its entire armed forces, a position that has remained vacant for months. And it now enters this phase with a senior naval commander missing from the single most important public display of institutional unity the regime has staged in this entire war, at the exact moment that commander's own branch of the military sits at the center of the most economically consequential flashpoint on the planet. Whatever the specific explanation for this one absence turns out to be, whether it's a security precaution, a strike Tehran hasn't yet acknowledged, or an internal reckoning happening entirely out of view, the pattern surrounding it tells its own story. This is a command structure under sustained, repeated, compounding stress, being asked to keep functioning coherently while operating one of the most consequential military campaigns in the region, at precisely the moment its own leadership pipeline has never looked less certain. Think back to where we started. A commander delivering a defiant, confident address to the cameras hours before, quietly disappearing from every photograph that mattered. That contrast, the public bravado and the private silence, is the entire story of Iran's military right now, compressed into a single missing man. A regime desperate to project strength and continuity to a watching world, while the actual, verifiable facts about who is still alive, still in command, and still capable of running a coherent military campaign grow murkier with every funeral, every state broadcast, and every carefully staged photograph that quietly leaves someone important out of the frame. Consider, too, what this uncertainty means for the ordinary sailors, officers, and enlisted personnel serving somewhere beneath this vanished commander in Iran's own navy right now. Militaries function because the people at the bottom of the chain trust that clear, accountable orders are coming from the top of it. When the officer at the top of that chain disappears without explanation, that trust doesn't collapse instantly, but it does begin to erode, quietly, unit by unit, in exactly the way that has historically preceded coordination failures and morale crises inside other militaries that have suffered comparable leadership shocks during wartime. A sailor on an Iranian vessel patrolling the strait right now has no more certainty about his own command structure than the analysts trying to piece it together from a funeral broadcast thousands of miles away. That uncertainty, compounding at every level of the institution simultaneously, from the Supreme Leader's own office down to individual ship crews, is precisely why experts describe this moment as more dangerous than any single missing commander could be on his own. Whether this particular commander turns out to be alive and simply absent for operational reasons, or the latest name added to a devastating list this war has already produced, the question hanging over every intelligence briefing in the region right now is the same one hanging over Iran's entire war effort. How many more of these gaps in the photograph can a command structure absorb before the gaps stop being individual mysteries and start being the whole story? And that question matters far beyond Iran's own borders, because a military, coordinating its most economically consequential operations through an uncertain, possibly fractured chain of command, is a genuinely dangerous variable for every government, every shipping company, and every energy market currently pricing risk into the Strait of Hormuz. Diplomacy depends on knowing who you're actually negotiating with. Deterrence depends on knowing whose decision it actually is to pull back from the brink. A vanished commander, layered on top of an uncertain supreme leader, layered on top of months of decapitated senior leadership, doesn't just make Iran's military weaker in the traditional sense of fewer resources or less firepower. It makes Iran's military less legible, less predictable, and according to nearly every risk assessment now circulating through regional capitals, considerably harder to safely de-escalate with. Precisely at the moment, de-escalation matters more than it has at any other point in this entire war. Thank you for watching. If this analysis helped you understand exactly what's happening beneath the surface of Iran's leadership crisis, make sure to like this video and drop a comment so more people can see the full picture. We will keep tracking every development in this story, because when it comes to Iran's command structure, the next name missing from the photograph is never far away.